Hi everyone, today we're going to be doing a feasibility study for a two-floor co-working solution. I've been getting a lot of requests for a larger space. So this one's circa 3,000 square meters or 32,000 square feet. And just an error of caution, I find the larger operations are starting to look a bit more risky in this market. You even see some of the larger global operators shying away from very large co-working operations. You know, I've also assisted with a lot of consolidation within the Asia Pacific market, meaning a traditional operator may have had 60,000 square feet because when the market was great, the margins were amazing because they were filling that flex space. But now because they're unable to pay rent, they had to pretty much, consolidate and squash that 60,000 back to a 30,000, even a 20,000, and hand those floors back to the landlord, which isn't great for the relationship, frankly, with that owner and your brand in the market. So I still wanted to do a 32,000 square feet feasibility study to demonstrate to you how I would do it if I were meant to cut this deal today. So if I was responsible for two floors and the thinking behind it. So I won't go through every single revenue line item. If you're interested in a proper P&L breakdown, there are other videos, other feasibility studies I've done where I go into that level of detail. But the purpose of this is more strategically how to allocate your floor, I think. And I think that's where the real value of this video will lie. So let's start. So you've got two floors, you've got one here and two there. And on the building stacking plan, frankly, it doesn't really matter where it goes because you could fight for the ground floor if you want some sort of ground floor presence, as in the lower floors integrating with the ground floor. But these days, the developer, whoever the building owner is, especially if it's a new development, they're going to slot you in where they want to slot you in. So it could be in the middle of the stacking plan. It'll never be at the top because the opportunity cost of renting those floors out will be too high for them. They could rent it out to like a really, high value tenant. So you're looking at probably somewhere in the middle here. And then honestly, if you really do see an opportunity, you can service the rest of the floors with your staff and your technology, something that's becoming really popular in our market. But, I've already seen prevalent in London, turnkey suites, meaning if you have a co-working operator in there with their correct infrastructure, so their network and their connectivity, you can extend it into the building. So if you sell a suite or a floor, rather than doing that deal on another floor, say this top floor here, normally what would happen is that tenant who did a lease on that floor would then have to wait 3-4 months for a telco provider like Telstra or Optus or whatever's in your market to put the internet and the infrastructure in. Whereas by having you in the building as a co-working operator with the infrastructure, they could sign the deal on Friday, they could move in on Monday, and the internet's there, right? Which is especially great for speculative suites in the market where it's already furnished because you just want them to move in, do those deals, right? So that's kind of bringing flexibility into traditional office a bit more, aside from the general co-working gist. So if I was to look, coming back to the floors, if I were to look at these two floors, level 1 and 2, so we're going to use loose numbers here. So they're each about 15,000 square feet. I know that's not exactly half, but this video is about the thinking, not necessarily the exact numbers. The first thing I would do is I would pretty much speak to the leasing agents who are appointed to the building or just agents in the market and understand what is the smallest floor or suite that a traditional tenant is still looking for. So someone that is not going to go to a co-working space and do a 6 to 12 month deal or month to month, but someone who's still looking to lease space, because maybe that could be half of level 2, right? And I'll just write tenant here. And I'll write co-working. Because if there's demand for this and you're doing a 3-year or a 5-year deal, right? And so that would be half of 15,000, 7,500 square feet, and someone just wants that quantum of space and they're willing to do a 3-5-year deal. I almost feel like if you can design your space to accommodate that type of clientele, And maybe it doesn't even live within your co-working P&L. It's an arrangement you have with the landlord where you'll service that space but be paid for it, but help them lease it out with a traditional leasing agent. It de-risks these 2 floors and this large 32,000 square foot amount of co-working that you have to fill. Because remember, the 80 to 85% occupancy quantum and target that you're normally trying to hit within a co-working facility, I think gets quite hard when you have a 32,000 square foot site. That's a lot of desks to move, which kind of brings me to desk densities, right? Because if you were going to, let me pull up my calculator here, take that whole floor, the whole 2 floors for co-working, and let's go with a desk density ratio of 75 square foot per workstation. You've got 430 workstations that you have to sell, right? And that's under the 32K, the 2 floors, the total floors. And even if you divide that, even if you look at how many of those will actually be in offices versus open plan, you're going to have about 366 of them in offices. Sorry. So 430 minus 3, and about 64 in open plan. You may even have more in the offices, right? So when you think about it, that's quite a lot to move. And in your market, what does that mean? 366 divided by, let's be generous, call it 8. You're going to have at least 45 offices that you have to move. So 45 customers, not including the open plan desks, right? So that occupancy target, especially if the market you're looking at is quite saturated with co-working, can be quite intimidating, right? Whereas if you go 15,000 plus, if you go for a 22,500 square foot total NLA, and you divide that by, you're looking at 300 workstations, right? And then that's around 255 in office, divided by 8, which is about 31 customers. It's getting messy, but you kind of see where I'm going, because if you can carve out that second floor so it's more of a traditional tenant who only needs a half floor solution but can't find it anywhere in the building, and they take a 3 to 5 year lease, I think that's a lot more attractive than trying to have what a lot of operators do is have enterprise suites, which aren't as big as like taking a 7,500 square foot space, but it might be like a 25 or a 30 person office. And honestly, I've seen a lot of floor plans within Australia and Asia having 2 or 3 of those just get stuck because they can't fill them. They might fill them initially and that P&L looks really great for a year or 2, but then when it's empty, it just stays empty because it's really hard to fill. So that's why I'm not too much of a fan of large enterprise suites. And if you're actually interested in a bigger quantum of space like the 32,000 square foot plus, you need to start investigating what does it look like if you carve your floor plan up to have your co-working, but then still have more traditional office leases as part of your offering, whether it's in your P&L or preferably an added service that you get paid for if the owner's trying to do that for themselves. Because within your co-working tenancy, you can service those spec suites, right? So you can differentiate them because your community managers in the floor and they can pop over and help them, or they can come and use the amenities that you have within your space, right? And so therefore, when you look at your revenue drivers, when you look at your P&L, you've got your co-working desks and then you've got your spec suite. So you've almost got 2 core income streams. And then obviously co-working, you've got your desks, you've got your meeting rooms, you've got your event space, you've got ancillary services, like, virtual services, concierge, registered addresses, mailing, all that kind of stuff. And then you've got a spec suite that's, a 3 to 5 year lease, essentially, potentially sitting in your P&L. The only times I think it should sit in your P&L is when you're doing your due diligence of the building and you're also working with an agent and they know they can sell that space or they already have interest in that space because someone sees that spec suite this tenancy as premium, because it's sitting within a co-working tenancy that's going to be serviced. It's not just a furniture showroom on another floor. There's an element of hospitality added to it. Okay. And then in terms of the staffing structure, if you're going for something as big as 32,000 square feet, you're going to need 3 full-time staff. What car was that? Anyway, you've got a center manager. You've got a community manager. It's all right, community. And you've got your concierge. So you need to budget for those. If you follow the concept of getting rid of half of the space because you're going to service that spec suite and that tenant, and it becomes more of a 22,500 square foot, you might be able to hybridize these two roles. So it becomes 2 FT. But those are the 3 core job descriptions you need to make this space run from a retention perspective, not just a filling, right? The center manager is responsible for the P&L, filling the space. Community manager, think of activations, and that's important from a retention perspective. They also help do the tours to free up the center manager. And then the concierge, think of them almost as the face, right? They're the first human interaction someone gets when they look into your space. So everyone's really important. So I think I'll stop the video there. Again, if you're interested in more detailed breakdowns of revenue, costs, and everything, go through my library of videos for the other FISOs because I actually pull up a model. And if you're more interested in seeing how desk densities are broken down in more detail, I've done a free methodology blueprint that you can download, right? I think transparency in this market is really important, not just for people trying to set up their own business because flexibility is becoming increasingly attractive in office markets, but also if you're a landlord watching this, it really helps you make those decisions about your new buildings or your redevelopments if you know what you're getting yourself into. Because I know it's scary because it's variable income. It's a business, right? It's not rent, it's a business. But if you understand where it comes from and what flexibility actually means, and even though there's lots of little offices, they're sold in this market, especially in Australia, increasingly 2 years plus at a time, it's quite stable. And because you're able to have conversations with those customers within the space, you can accommodate their needs. A lot of them grow, some downsize, but you figure it out, right? It's a symbiotic relationship. Okay, so hopefully that was helpful, and I'll speak to you again soon.